China is one of the countries with the most to lose if Hormuz stays unstable. That is exactly why the veto matters, because when the country most exposed to the disruption still votes no, you are no longer looking at a simple energy story. You are looking at a hierarchy story. That is the real entry point. The easy reading says China backed Iran. The harder and much more accurate reading says China chose short-term pain because long-term dependence was more dangerous than short-term disruption. That is what happened on the 7th of April inside the UN Security Council. A resolution came up that on paper looked straightforward. Restore freedom of transit through the Strait of Hormuz, calm the markets, protect the global economy, get the route flowing again. That is how it was sold. And if you stop there, the Chinese veto looks absurd. China needs Gulf oil. China buys enormous volumes of Iranian oil. A disrupted Hormuz hurts China badly. So why block the fix? Because the fix was not neutral. That is the key. The most important phrase in the entire draft was all necessary means. Those three words tell you almost everything in diplomatic English. That phrase is not passive. It is not administrative. It is how a root reopening resolution becomes a legal bridge to force. It is how a shipping crisis becomes a military mandate with institutional cover. That is why Beijing objected. And that is why the later revisions are so revealing. The original draft was highly aggressive. It effectively opened the way toward forceful enforcement around the strait. China pushed back, Russia pushed back. The text was softened, some of the more aggressive logic was stripped out, the draft was diluted, and China still vetoed it. That tells you the problem was never just one line of text. The problem was the underlying structure, even in a softened form. Beijing still saw the same strategic pattern, a crisis around a critical choke point being converted into a pathway for re-legitimized American power. That is the real story. Because from China's point of view, the immediate disruption in Hormuz, while painful, is still less dangerous than a world in which the United States proves, once again, that it can restore order through force and then wrap that force in international legitimacy. That is the bigger threat. China has lived for years with the fear that its industrial rise still depends on maritime routes whose final guarantor remains Washington. The Malacca dilemma captured that fear in one geography, but the larger logic goes beyond Southeast Asia. If the U.S. can decisively manage the choke points that feed China's economy, then China's rise remains structurally dependent no matter how powerful it looks on paper. Now, apply that logic to Hormuz. Imagine Washington reopening the strait by force under an unbacked framework and showing the entire world that even now, in an era of supposed American decline, the most important energy artery feeding the world, our biggest manufacturing economy, still sits under an order ultimately enforced by the United States. That is not just a short-term setback for Beijing. That is strategic resubordination. And that is why China vetoed. The point was not to protect disruption forever. The point was to refuse a solution that would restore dependence at a higher level than the disruption itself. This is why the veto makes more sense the more coldly you think about it. China was not choosing between pain and comfort. China was choosing between pain now and dependence later. And for Beijing, dependence was the worst outcome. That is the first layer. The second layer is economic, but not in the simple oil price hurts China sense most people stop at. Hormuz is not just about barrels. It is also about the petrodollar system wrapped around those barrels. That matters because the oil trade has been one of the hidden supports of American power for decades. Oil price in dollars creates global dollar demand. That demand recycles into us assets. Those assets support the broader architecture of American deficits, liquidity, and financial dominance. So when Hormuz becomes unstable, the stress does not stop at energy. It starts touching the monetary order built around energy. That is where Beijing sees long-term advantage inside short-term pain, because China has spent years building alternatives that matter most when the old order looks fragile. Yuan settlement channels, belt and road payment infrastructure, deeper energy integration with Russia and Iran. None of these replace the dollar in normal times. But normal times are not the point. The point is what happens when a system begins to look politically contingent and strategically weaponized. In stable times, alternatives feel optional. In stress times, alternatives feel necessary. That is the transition China wants to accelerate. Every week of unresolved pressure on Hormuz is another week in which the old energy financial order looks less inevitable. Another week in which more states begin asking whether they need redundancy, optionality, and less reliance on a system whose guardian can also weaponize it. That is why the short-term pain does not automatically make the veto irrational. Beijing is not only pricing current oil flows, it is pricing future system architecture. And from that perspective, helping the United States restore confidence in the old choke point order may be much more expensive than enduring instability. Now go to the third layer. China was able to make this move because it has spent years building buffers, not immunity buffers. That difference matters. Strategic petroleum reserves, supplier diversification, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, overland corridor planning, deepened ties with Russia and Iran, massive domestic expansion in solar, wind, nuclear, and coal flexibility. All of these pieces serve one strategic purpose: reduce exposure to any single external point of failure long enough to survive a fractured system. China is not comfortable with Hormuz instability, but Beijing does not need comfort. It needs survivable stress. That is the threshold. And if Beijing believes its buffers are stronger than the ability of the United States to translate this crisis into a renewed claim of maritime guardianship, then the veto becomes not only rational, but necessary. Now we reach the legal and narrative dimension. This is where China extracted more than material leverage. It extracted meaning at the Security Council. The Chinese position was that the draft did not address root causes. Russia echoed that. Whether one agrees is not the point. The point is how that language travels across the world. In much of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, there is deep fatigue with the pattern of force first, legal cover later. Many governments already suspect that rules are too often applied selectively. So when China vetoes a resolution that still looks, even in revised form, like a route toward legitimized force against a state already hit militarily, Beijing gains narrative credit. It gets to say, we refuse automatic legalization of escalation. That matters. Because in geopolitics, narrative credit is not decoration. It shapes alignments, it shapes trust, it shapes who looks like the defender of sovereignty and who looks like the manager of exceptions. That gives China an advantage well beyond the immediate vote. Now step back again. The biggest significance of the 7th of April is not only what it said about Hormuz, it is what it said about the world system. For decades after the Cold War, the U.S. operated with a level of institutional freedom that often made international legitimacy feel like something that would eventually bend into place. Russia was too weak to stop much of it. China was still rising. The result was a deep assumption that American strategic necessity would often become the final grammar of order. That era is fading, and the veto made that painfully clear. The United States went to the UN seeking legitimacy for what it framed as an essential outcome around one of the most important energy choke points on Earth, and it failed not because of procedure, not because of bad timing, because two major powers refused. That is not a side note. That is the event. It means the old system no longer restores itself automatically. It means there are now real limits on America's ability to convert force into universally accepted legality. It means multipolarity is no longer a forecast. It is a working condition. That is why the vote matters so much. Militarily, China shaped the field without firing a shot. Economically, it accepted near-term pain to avoid locking in a more dangerous energy hierarchy. Politically, it positioned itself as a state refusing selective enforcement. Narratively, it strengthened its standing across the global south. That is a remarkable amount of gain from one veto, and it leads to the core conclusion. The question was never why China would block a resolution to reopen a route it depends on. The real question was why China would ever help restore a strategic order in which the United States can, again, present itself as the natural, legal, final manager of the choke points that feed China's economy. Beijing refused that restoration. That is what the veto means. This was not a defensive reflex. It was a strategic declaration. China chose short-term pain because long-term dependence was worse. And once you understand that, the vote stops looking paradoxical. It starts looking inevitable. China did not block a shipping fix. It blocked the return of a hierarchy. And that is why the world saw the vote, but missed the decision inside it.